Okay, so I want to play a little catch up on some of the stuff that we've talked about today. We're going to do a couple of things that we haven't had a chance to get to. Then we'll take a look at the pen tool assignments that were turned in. We'll go over those guys, and then finally we start retouching today. So, not that this matters, but just curious, how many people in this class signed up for this class because they're interested in learning how to retouch beauty the correct way? Okay, so there's several of you. Again, this is not a beauty fashion class, whatever, but skin is one of the most challenging things that there actually is to retouch when it comes from a texture point of view, so it's just a good candidate for us to work with. There's a lot of really bad information about how to retouch beauty, so we're going to talk about the different levels of it and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, if that's one of the reasons that you sign up for this class, today is your day. Today is definitely going to be a Wacom tablet day kind of day today. So if you've got your Wacom tablet, please get it out and please get it hooked up and ready to rock. Because while you're doing that, I want to go over a couple of things that we're not really going to work on, but I want to explain what's happening here. And this is a perfect example right here at the very beginning. If you take a look at this image right here, and this, again, I just picked out the first image that I came across that actually showed the problem. You can see we have issues right here about where you end up with imperfect selections. And you would think, the idea behind this would be that you would think that what this really has to do with is transparency at edges. And so the supposition would be, if you've got an edge that is at 50% and you actually let's say you save that selection, and then you invert the selection and do another, again, by its definition, let's say the first selection was built on your subject and had a 50% edge, and then your second selection is your background and it also has a 50% edge. And you would think where those two actually overlap that it would be 50% plus 50% equals 100%. Doesn't that kind of make sense? Do you guys understand what it is I'm talking about here? However, that's not the way Photoshop deals with transparency, and that is why we end up with this problem right here. And it's not only here, you can see it down here as well. You can see it's this hole. See this little white edge that's running along down here along her hand? All of this has to do with the real way Photoshop deals with transparency. And so we need to have that conversation, because people look at this and say, well, that's a mistake. That's not a mistake. It doesn't mean that that isn't something that you're going to need to correct depending on what you're trying to do. But as far as how Photoshop generated this thing, that's not a mistake, and this is why. So this gets a little confusing, but I still feel like you guys all can understand this. So if we take a look at this, these are two things, a set of scales that were created in Photoshop. If you take a look at this first scale that's up right here, it goes from 0 to 100%, and this is just brightness here. So 0 would be black, 100% would be white. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on? So let's say I loaded this as a selection and then actually saved it, and then inverted that selection and saved the inversion. Well, what would happen to the inversion? It would be just the opposite. I would have 0 over on this side going all the way up to 100 on this side. And again, you would think that the interaction of this is that, okay, 0 plus 100 equals 100, and 100 plus 0 equals 0, and 50 plus 50 equals 100. I mean, you would think that these would all come out as 100%, but they don't. What Photoshop ends up doing is that it looks at both of these, and then it does the way they would interact with one another. And so the result of it is this. So if you take a look at this side right here and you say, okay, 0% of 100 is 0, and that actually works out to be 0. So this is the scale that we have on the bottom is the result. And 100%, I'm going all the way on the other side now, 100% here, 100% of 0 would also be 0. But then when we get into the degrees of transparency, so if you're working at 100% or 0%, perfect white or perfect black, you have no transparency. But once we start getting into those transparencies, this is what happens. So again, if we do the inverse of this, if we have, okay, this is 10% here, and then if I inverted the selection and saved it, the opposite of that would be 90%, and if we added them up, it would still be 100%, but Photoshop does not add them up. Photoshop multiplies them by each other. And what ends up happening is that you end up with 10% of 90, which is 9. That's a very dark gray. You also, on the flip side, have 90% of 10, which is also 9, which is also a dark gray. By the time you start to move up to the 50%, what you end up with is 50% of 50 is 25%, which is a 64 in our scale of 0 to 255. So this is what explains those edges, that sort of edge line that we're getting in here. The reason that you're seeing this right here, let me zoom in and take a quick shot at what's going to show this to us. Right here, you can see that there is transparency in this edge. So here, her skin is complete. Here, there's no skin here at all. But here we have that transparent transition that's going from the mask. If we take a look at the mask, you can see it probably easier just looking at the mask. You can see right here, and let me zip out just a little bit. Right here, we've got 100% white here, 100% black here. But in this transition that's happening here across this, if I invert that, we get it going in the opposite direction, and inevitably in there, you're going to find that spot where you've got 50% over 50%. And again, Photoshop does not add them together. Photoshop multiplies them, and so you end up with a half of a half is a quarter. And in this case, if you take a look at the result of this, this is ultimately what we get is that white line. Does that make sense, everybody, what I'm talking about here? So when you see these things, don't automatically look at it and say you screwed something up. That's actually not true. It actually played out exactly the way you would expect it to do. Now, if you needed to fix this, what you end up then is going in and you have to, basically you have to say to yourself at this stage of the game, okay, I'm either going to dedicate that to be skin or I'm going to dedicate it to be her sweater. You got to pick one, and you would go in and then refine that mask to actually pick whether you wanted it to be skin or whether you wanted it to be sweater. Does that sort of make sense, everyone? But right now, building these masks based on the luminosity and the transparency, this is correct, right? And that also means this up here is correct as well. Even though that looks horrible, it is correct. Make sense? All right. I want to do 2 exercises before we actually look at the pen tool stuff, and I want you guys to do this with me. One of them is actually going to be, so I sent out an announcement last week not to do assignment 5.4 because we hadn't gone over that material. We're going to go over that material here in class, and if you do the assignment here in class and then turn it in, guess what your grade's going to be on that assignment? I know, right? I thought everybody, that's so sweet. I thought everybody needed a bit of a break here, so at any rate. However, before I do that one, I want to go over I want to do another quick file. This is going to be a quick jaunt out to the left, but you remember when we actually go into either the refine edge space or the select and mask space, I keep telling you guys that all of the edge refinements that exist in there, the shift edge or the expand edge or the run contrast, that you can do that better manually. I want to show you how to do that. That was actually on our schedule for stuff to do last week. We didn't get a chance to get to it, so I want to actually get to it now. And I want to do that before we do your homework assignment, only because that'll allow you to understand how we're going to do the homework assignment, part of the homework assignment anyway. So, I feel like the newscaster, what they say in news is that the newscaster job is to do everything 3 times. They tell you what they're going to tell you, and then they tell it to you, and then they tell you what they've told you, right? I feel like I'm halfway through that process right now. Sorry, let me... It's wrong that my phone service company keeps sending me shit about how great they are, isn't it? Okay, so if I can get everybody to go to your session 5 folder. And inside your session 5 folder is a file called Choke and Spread. if you can find that guy. So again, session 5, choke and spread. Go ahead and open this guy up. So this is the beginning of a composite. Let me crank my screen up just a little bit. Okay. So ignore the fact that not all of this matches. This isn't going to be about matching scale or perspective or any of that kind of stuff. We actually will get into that. That happens in a couple of weeks when we get into the more serious part of the compositing. But this relates still specifically to the whole selection tool process of it all. So I need everybody to zoom in and take a look at this girl's, take a look at her left shoulder. It's the easiest place to spot this. And if you take a look at her left shoulder, if you zoom in, you'll actually see that there is a green line that runs all the way around her. So has everybody got this file open and can see that green line? So this is what happens. And if you take a look, if you want to see the file where this actually started, hold down your Shift key and click on the layer mask for this. And you can see this was actually shot in the studio on green screen. We will go over actually doing this specific thing in class. A few weeks from now, we actually will meet in the studio to go over how you really set this up, frame it, light it, all that kind of stuff here. But basically, the idea behind all of this is that you try to establish a color, a solid single color that's behind this person, and then because if you can really get to that holy grail of it being a pure single color, then it's incredibly easy to select it and you get rid of it, right? But the problem that we run into with this, and you'll find this in not only your green screen work, but if you're doing any sort of knocking out that's based on luminosity or hue, like this one actually is, what ends up happening is that you get this, again, to turn the mask off, still hold down your Shift key and click on the X that goes through it, and then you'll see. What ends up happening is this, is that due to its very nature, digital files are soft. So what happens is that when you make an exposure with your camera, your sensor has a typical sensor. Most 35 millimeter sensors now here are 3,000 pixels by 6,000 pixels. So if you do all the math, if you add it all up, or no, I take it back, they're 2,000 by 3,000 pixels, it ends up to be about 6 million pixels. But when you develop that file out, it turns into an 18 million, so you go from 6 megabits, 6 megabytes to 18 megabytes when you develop the file out. What's happening is that you need to hang on here 1 second. Sorry. What happens is this. So this is sorry. This is basically a sensor. If you think about this, so this is a sensor, and this is sort of a three-dimensional diagram of a sensor. And what you'll see on it is that it looks like these small little containers, and that's actually what happens in your sensor. What your sensor does is it actually collects photons. So when you make an exposure, photons come into it. So if you have one of these that actually doesn't end up with any photons in it, then that would actually turn out to be a black pixel for your image. And if you turn out and have an image in here that is completely full, then that would actually be a much lighter pixel in your image. The thing about it is that the problem that you have in all of this is that all sensors, with very few exceptions, all sensors that you guys have ever met in a 35mm camera, for the most, has anybody in here ever worked with a Foveon camera? Yeah, I didn't think so. So other than that, every sensor that you guys work with is a black and white sensor. It does not know or understand color. All it does, it opens up, it just, photons come into it, it counts the number of photons and sends that information to the computer, then your camera, and it just says, okay, it filled up with 0 pixels, meaning that would be a black area of your image, or it ended up filling halfway up, which would be a middle gray in your image, or it filled all the way up, which would be a white in your image. However, that doesn't really help us. What we wanted was color in our image. So the way that they actually ultimately dealt with color would be to actually do this. They cover your sensor with filters. And the filters are either red, green, or blue. And what these filters do is, you can see right down here, what ends up happening is that if you have a blue photon and it actually reaches a blue filter, it will pass through that. The filter will allow it to pass. But that same blue filter will reject all the red and the green. So the only thing that ever comes into the cavity, the cavity that's actually underneath this, of the blue filter would be blue photons. The only thing that comes into the green would be green, and the only thing that comes into the red would be red. And so this gives us, and these are, again, you've got, thousands and thousands of these on your sensor, so they're very, very, very small. However, to create a full color image, you need an RGB value at every single one of these. And so what they do through very tricky math is this. So if we imagine here, again, this isn't a math class or a physics class. I just, guys, want you to understand what happens is that if you take a look at this, so we're going to call this is your sensor right here. This is just a small little area of your sensor. Does that make sense to everyone? So if you take a look at G10, green 10, so our 10th column or 10th row in this, whatever, G10, whatever, only green pixels are coming in there. And in the R11, only red pixels are coming in there. And in the B14, only blue pixels are coming in there. But we need an RGB value for every single one of these. These represent a pixel. And so the way they do this is by math. This is how they actually figure it out. So if we take a look right here, we're gonna figure out the RGB values for R19 right here. So this pixel that's right here, this guy that's right here, the way they figure it out is this. So the red value is strictly the photon count that comes in here. Again, the red filter allows all the red photons to come through, and it just counts up those photons. That's all it does. But then to figure out the green value, because there's no green pixels can get through that red filter. So what they do is they take the 4 green pixels that surround it and they add those up. They divide it by 4. So they take the average of the 4 pixels that are surrounded, and that is the value that you get for the green at R19. Does that make sense, everyone? And then for the blue, they do the same thing. They take the 4 pixels that surround it, so B14, 16, 22, and 24. They add those up, divide by 4. They're just taking the average of those, and they assign that value to the blue that's sitting right there. So you get, at R19, you get not only a red value, but a green value and a blue value. Does that make sense to everybody what's talking about? The problem with this is that you are taking information that is not discrete for that pixel. You're taking information from around it and bringing it in to give you a value for that pixel. And that creates softness. Does that make sense? So you guys have heard of pre-sharpening. When you bring a file into Camera Raw, there's a whole pre-sharpening value that happens right there. That pre-sharpening is designed to combat this because this builds softness into your image. But there's another thing, and the other thing that does it is this. This happens throughout Photoshop. Photoshop is constantly battling this problem. And so what Photoshop does very cleverly is that it looks for edges in your image and it sharpens those edges. But sharpening is really just a contrast move. So what's happening here, if we go back to our Photoshop image and take a look at it, what's happening here is this is an area where the green background is meeting the black coat. That is an edge. Photoshop finds that edge and then takes all the pixels that run slightly on the green part and all the ones that run slightly on the black part. It actually selects those pixels and runs contrast on it, which makes the green of the background is no longer the green of the background. It has now been made contrastier. In most cases, it's made darker. In some cases, it's actually made lighter. But what it's doing is that it's trying to actually give you a sharp edge here. But in our case, what happens is that it's no longer part of the green background that we selected. It falls outside of that. And so what we end up with is this line. Does that make sense to everyone? And you will find this all the time. So we need to get rid of that line. And you could go in here and try and work your magic, painting on your masking, doing all of that kind of stuff. But there's a better way to do this, and that's the part that I want to show you right now. To start with, though, we need to talk about something. So I need everybody to do this really quickly. Do a brand new synthetic file. So just Command N will bring up your new file dialog box. Again, I'm going to change my drop-down menu to inches, and I'm going to make this 8 by 11 is fine. I do want to make it 300 pixels per, 300 pixels per inch. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. You just need to basically get an image up and going. This is actually one that's on a white background. Is everybody good on this part right now? Okay. I do want to do a square that's in, or a rectangle that's in the middle of this, and I want guidelines on it so that you can actually see the movement that we're going to get into. So I'm going to grab one guideline and just drag it down. I'm going to grab another line and drag it down. If your rulers are not showing, go to your view menu, come down to rulers and put a check mark next to it so that you will see it. And then all I'm doing is clicking on the ruler and dragging across. So I'm going to pull all of this stuff out like that. And so this is basically where I'm going to actually start to work with on this guy. So at this point, I'm going to create a new layer. So I just clicked on the icon at the bottom of my layers palette, the little square with the plus in the middle of it. It just gives us a new blank layer. I'm going to hit the M key or just select the marquee tool. So it's the second tool down from the top. If you click on the drop down, make sure it is the rectangular marquee tool. You also want to make sure, again, your eye should go immediately up to the options bar. You should check to make sure your feather is set to 0, that your style is set to normal, and then simply come over and you can click on your top left corner, or depending, you can do your top right corner. Anyway, you just want to click and select the area that's in that's bounded by that box. You'll notice that the marching ants want to snap to the guidelines that we pulled out, which is exactly what I want. Now I want to fill this thing with black. In order to do that, I'm actually going to I need to hit the D key first to get my foreground and background colors to default to black and white. Black is now my foreground color, so Option Delete will fill that with black. Command D to deselect. So what I've got now is I've got a white background. If I turn it off, you'll see I've also got a layer that's got this black square on it that's sitting on a completely transparent area. Does everybody have that part? Okay. I'm going to show you another shortcut here that I want everybody to know, because this is going to come up over and over and over and over and over in this class. I need you to select the top layer of this really quickly, and then you're going to do this keyboard shortcut. So again, all the Windows people know that Command is Control. So again, I'm going to give it out in Mac terms, but you'll understand it. I have not forgotten to send you that. You can't believe, we'll talk. That just reminded me of that when I said the thing about Windows. All right, so anyway, so for the Mac people, hold down the Command, Option, and the Shift key. Keep all three of those held down and hit the letter E. And what this does is it creates a merge stamp version of everything that was visible. So if you take a look now, there's a brand new layer that's sitting on top that is a combination of this black square and the white square that's actually underneath it. Did everybody get that? I hold down the Command key, the Command, Option, and Shift. All three of them, Command, Option, Shift, and then hit the letter E. And it gives you this guy. So did everybody get this? Did anybody not get this? All right, I want you to throw that one away. So again, it's already highlighted. All you need to do is hit your delete or backspace key. It goes back to the beginning. Now I want you to select the background under it, and I want you now to do the same keyboard shortcut. So Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and you'll see it does the same thing, but look where it put your combined version of this. So it's important that you know this, that whatever layer is selected, your combined layer is always going to simply go right above it. Now, and if the top layer is the one that you've got selected, you're fine. It'll be on the very top. But if it is not, it will put it somewhere down into the body of your layer stack, and that may not be where you want it. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on? Are we good about that? Okay. Throw that layer away, that second layer is away. Select the top one again, and now I want you to turn the eyeball off. Turn the eyeball off on the background layer. So I've got the top layer selected, the one that's actually got the black cube in it. The background layer's eyeball is turned off, and then do the same keyboard shortcut, Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E. And in this case, you'll see we don't get anything because there's nothing to actually combine. I'm going to put a blank layer above it and see if it'll allow me to do this again. So now I've got just a blank layer above it. Its eyeball is on, the eyeball it's on for the layer number 1, and then again the background is turned off, Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and it does put it up on the very top. The reason I wanted to show you guys this one is that layer visibility is everything in this. If your layers are turned off, they don't get merged into it. This is a merge stamp visible. It has to be, your layer has to be visible. It has to be turned on to become part of this merge. But we use this trick over and over and over and over again in this class. So it's just something for you guys to be aware of. We good on that part? All right. So I'm going to throw this away, and then I'm going to turn on my background layer. And what I want in all of this is a version of this where they're all put together. So again, I've got my top layer that is just the cube on the black on a transparent background. Both of the eyeballs are on, Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and I'll actually then creates this. And if we zoom in now and take a look at it, you can see that the edge of your square is right on the lines, on these guidelines, so that we can tell basically where they're going to actually go. Everybody's got this merged version in the guidelines on there, right? Are we good? Yeah. Let me see. Then just come up to your view menu, down to guides, and over to clear guides. Then you can just get rid of the guides, and then you can pull new ones. And if you select your layer that's got a transparent background, it'll find it. So it's really easy. So then you just click and drag out, and it'll snap right to it. So click and drag the guideline out, you'll see it'll pop right to it. And then just do all 4 of those, and then you'll be good. Okay. So I need everybody to zoom in. I'm going to zoom into the top left-hand corner. You can do this you don't necessarily have to be at a corner. And I'm at like 500% right now. And I'm going to blur this image. So again, you can take a look at it right now. You can see that white on this outside part, black on the inside part, and it meets with this really hard edge. But I'm going to blur this image right now. Up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And I'm going to put a blur of 10 on it. That's a little too much. I'm going to put a blur, well, yeah, 10 will be fine. And say OK. And you can see now what's actually happened is that we have a blurry edge. Did everybody get a blurry edge? Okay. So what makes this look blurry? What did we really do? We did what? We did make a gradient on the edges, and so what happens on this gradient is that we go from black that's right here in the middle into really dark grays, into middle grays, into lighter grays, and then finally back out to white again, right? So what I've done is I've introduced shades of gray between that white and black. So it started out unsoftened, unblurred. I had a pure white that met a pure black with a really hard line. But now I've got shades of gray. I've got a gradient that goes between the two, right? And I can now use levels to shift that gradient, because what levels do is they reset the values that you are going to, they take tones and they reset them to a different tone, right? So this is what I mean by that. We're going to bring up the levels dialog box, Command L. Again, I'm not going to do this. This is not an adjustment layer. And what you'll see is it's a very spare histogram, and that's because there's not a whole lot of grays that are in here. There's a ton of black and there's a ton of white and very few little grays in the middle. But look what happens when this. I'm going to grab my black point slider that's right underneath the histogram on the far left side. I'm going to grab this and I'm going to start dragging it towards the middle. And look what happens to the image. Because what I'm now doing is I'm saying I want those gradients, what were those dark grays, I want them to be black. And so as a consequence, I'm expanding this black beyond the original lines. Does that make sense to everybody what's going on? This is actually called a spread. If you zero that back out again, so drag it all the way back again to the other way, I'm going to actually grab now my white point slider and drag it towards the middle, and you'll see we go in the opposite direction. Now what I'm doing is, this is called a choke. And so what's happening here is I'm saying I want all of those in between grays to be white. And so it's actually pushing this down. So if you think about this white, this black object that's in the middle here as being a mask, I can control the edge. I can make it larger or I can make it smaller. That's called choking and spreading. Does this make sense, everybody, what we just did? All right, so we're going to actually use this in our work for compositing. You can throw this guy away. You don't need to keep it. And we're going to go back to this right here. So if you take a look at this, I'm going to take a look at just, so I'm selected my top image. I'm zoomed in on that shoulder. If you hold down your Option key and click on the layer mask, you can see the layer mask itself. And you can see primarily it's black. There's a little bit of transition grays in the middle here, but very, very few of them. And then, it's white, which allows, in my mask, allows the figure to show black, which is hiding the background part of this. And there's a slight amount of transition here. However, I want to choke this thing. I want to use that same principle that we just did to make my mask a little bit smaller so that I get rid of that green line. Does that make sense, everybody, what's going on here? You'll see this happen in real time. However, before we do that, so I'm going to click back out of this, make sure that you do have your layer mask is highlighted. The brackets are around it because we're doing the work on the layer mask. At this stage of the game, I want to make a history snapshot of this before I do anything, because what history snapshots allow you to do is actually paint with history to go back and forth. So I want to be able to go back and forth. I'm going to choke this image right now, but I want to be able to go back in areas. There's certain areas that I may not want to choke. In those areas, I need to have a reference of them so that I can go backwards. So to do that, we're going to start right here. In your history palette, if you come over, there's a little camera that sits at the very bottom of the history palette. If you click on that camera, you should get a dialog box that opens up offering to give you a new snapshot. Did anybody not get this snapshot dialog box? So look at your history palette. At the bottom of it, there are three little icons. There's a garbage can, camera, and then looks like a piece of paper folded over with a plus on it. You want to click on the camera. And you should get this dialog box that opens up offering to call this thing Snapshot 1. Did anybody not get that? Okay, if you didn't get it, the easy way to get it, click on the menu that's actually just to the right of the tab that says History in the drop down. Come down to History Options and make sure that you click on the automatically create new snapshot when saving, and you click on the show new snow. This was the first really cold week we've had yet this year, and I'm just like, yeah, it's going to be a foot of snow in a week. All right, so anyway, sorry, I digress. And also click on the Show New Snapshot dialog by default and say OK to that. Now when you click on the little camera, it'll offer you the ability to name it. And we want to call ours pre-choke. and say OK to that. Now, if you look at the very top of your history palette up in here, you'll actually see that you've got two snapshots that are sitting up at the very top. One of them is called chokeandspread.psd. That's what your image is named, and that was the state it was in when we opened it up. You'll also notice that to the left of the thumbnail, it looks like a little paintbrush with a circle on it, or an arrow that's going counterclockwise on it. That indicates that this is when we use the history brush, what we are going to do is we will be painting with what this image looked like when that state was actually made. Again, this will make sense hopefully in just a second here. So, and then you can actually change that. We can actually click on the pre-choke state that's right here. If you click on the little box to the left of the thumbnail, now when we paint with history, it will look like the way the image looks when we created this, our pre-choke state. You do not want to be selecting these states. Look what happens if you select a state. I'm going to select, don't do this, just watch my screen. I'm going to select my pre-choke state right here, and when I do that, all of my history in the drop-down part of my history palette gets grayed out. And the problem with that is that if I do anything else, watch what happens. I'm just going to do a selection. I'm going to click and drag out. You lose all the history that happened before this. You don't want that to happen. So when I say to change your history states here, you're strictly clicking on these the areas to the left of the thumbnail. You're not selecting the state itself. You're just moving where that history brush goes. So I'm going to hit Command D to deselect that. I've still got my pre-choke state. I'm going to go back to my original one here. So now we're going to actually choke this image. This will hopefully make sense in just 1 second. Okay. So make sure that your history state is, that your layer mask is selected. And hang on, I knew there was something I hadn't plugged in. All right. So to do this, the first thing we need to do is introduce those shades of gray between the two. So again, hold down your Option key and click on the mask itself. We're going to blur the mask. So up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And in my case, it comes up, I've got the 10 because it's sticky from last time. This is too strong of a blur. Now, people will say, well, how much do you blur this all the time? You know, whatever. It depends on the resolution of your image. If you have a really high-res image, this number is going to be higher. If you have a really low-res image, it's going to be lower. Guys, this is where the art part of all this comes in. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this process right now. If it turns out that we picked the wrong amount of blur, there's nothing that stops you from just undoing it all and doing it all over again. It's not that many steps. Make sense? So I'm going to try to give you a feeling for the blur that I'm looking for, the typical one that I'm doing. So I'm going to crank this down to around a 3 or a 4. Actually, we need a little bit more than that. So I'm thinking around a 5 looks about the right number to me. Again, what I'm really looking for is to introduce these levels of gray in between. If you hold your preview and check it on and off, you'll see those are the, so we're adding levels of gray between on this entire edge. Does that make sense to everyone? So go ahead and say okay. I take that back. Cancel out. I just want you to see, I want you to know what's going on in the mask, but I also want you to see this in real time. So I'm going to select the pixel part of my layer right here, which gives me the whole image again, and then again, select the mask so that the brackets are around the mask. And we're going to do the same blur, up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And you can see that that 5, so I've still got the 10 pixel because that part is sticky. So I'm going to type in 5 pixels. And what it does is it actually makes this problem worse. And that's correct. That is the way we start out. You make the problem worse first. And then go ahead and say okay to that. Then again, making sure that your mask is still the thing that we're operating on, Command L to bring up the levels dialog box. And in this case, you don't need to worry about remembering, do you move the black slider or the white slider? You can actually just start one, and if it's wrong, if it makes this problem worse, then just undo it, and go to the other side. So anyway, I'm going to start with the black slider on the left side, right underneath my histogram. I'm going to click and drag it towards the right, and you can see as I start to pull this in, it actually is choking this mask, and it gets rid of that green line. But there's a problem that I have with this. If you take a look at this edge now, you can say, I'm looking at the edge of the coat, well, yeah, Verser, that's great. I mean, it got rid of the green line, but look at how soft that edge is. Well, again, we haven't closed up the levels dialog box yet. Levels dialog box, if you start to pull in both your black point and your white point, we're going to start to reintroduce, we're going to up the contrast in our mask. So grab your white point now and start pulling it towards the center, and you'll see it firms up, it tightens up that edge. Now, you don't want to crank it all the way in. If you bring them in so that your black point and your white point actually touch each other, which you can do, you'll have this really sharp edge. It'll look like it's actually been cut out. In our case, we want to keep a little bit of that softness and that feathering in there. But did this get rid of the spill for you guys? Nice, right? Okay, so say okay to that. Before you do anything else, you need another history state. So come over to your history palette, click on the little camera, it'll open it up, and you want to call this history state post choke. Hang on one second. What? Sorry. And then you need to do another history state and call it post choke. So now what you can see is I've got 3 history states. I've got choke and spread, that's what my image looked like when I opened it. I've got pre-choke, which is what my image looked like right before I did this choke, and then post-choke, what it looks like after that. So to see what this really means is that I'm going to leave the history state, history brush icon next to the pre-choke thumbnail. If you then come over to your tool palette and you want to come down to the, it's underneath the clone stamp tool. So if you can find your clone stamp tool, it's the thing that looks like an old-time stamp. Right underneath that is the history brush. If you click on the lower right-hand corner, you'll get the flyout menu. You can see you can do either the history brush or the art history brush. You want to make sure that history brush is what you use here. Then up at your options palette, again, we automatically look up there first thing. You want to click on this. It doesn't necessarily matter whether you have a soft or a hard brush on this. I'm going to leave mine as a medium hardness brush. And the reason is that because history is going to control what you can really paint. So 100% opacity, 100% flow, and a normal blending mode. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller, and I'm simply going to, again, make sure that your layer mask is selected, because we're going to be painting in history. And if I had my image selected and I started to paint on this, it would return it to the history of what this pixel content of this layer looked like when I made the history snapshot. It's a smart object. I can't change the pixel content of it, so you won't see anything different. But if you select the mask is the one thing that we changed between our pre-choke state and our post-choke state. So with pre-choke selected, come just do a line that runs right down part of your sleeve, and you'll see it brings that green edge back to this. It returns our image to what it looked like before we choked it. If you then click on the left area of the thumbnail, again, do not pick the history state. Do not click on the word that says post-choke. That's the state. You simply want to click on the little square that's to the left of the thumbnail of that. When you click on that, now the history that we will paint with is what the image looked like after it was choked. And now you can actually paint away the line that you just painted in. So what you see here is that this now gives us the ability to go back and forth between the two states, and actually then we can have this image that is partially choked and also part of it that is not choked at all. Does that make sense, everyone? So why does this matter? If you zip back out and then zoom into her hair, even though you guys didn't necessarily see this happen, this actually butchered her hair. So I want to go back to the pre-choke state. So again, I'm going to go to the very top of my history palette, click on the little box to the left of the thumbnail that says pre-choke. I'm going to make my history brush larger. And then I'm just going to paint around the outside edge of her hair. It's all the feathery, fine part of her hair. So I'm going to start close to her eyeball, and I'm going to start to paint. And you'll see it's bringing back all the fine, feathery part of her hair. It's bringing back spill as well. I'm not concerned about that. I just want a good edge back there. I'm not going to do any of that on her body, because all of the stuff on her body is actually did exactly what I wanted it to do. It got rid of all this, because that green line went around her entire body. However, if you come into the bottom of her shoes, this is another place where you can run into this. It did that choke all the way around her. And the thing is that I didn't have that green line on the underside of her shoes. I have it on her entire body. It goes all the way around, but I just know this image well enough. If you come over now, again, using your history brush in the pre-choke phase, if you paint underneath the bottom of her feet, under her soles, you'll actually see it returns part of the shoe that was actually missing. So I'm going to go Command-Z to undo it. So look at my screen right here. You can see this. The sole that's running underneath her shoe, as it moves back to the heel, it simply disappears in here. You need to bring that part back. Now, it restores that line. There's green there. That's okay, because that's spill. I can fix the spill. If you take a look at the bottom of the sole as well, it's also been sort of like rounded off. You want to restore that part to it as well. And then usually on the front, underneath the sole, those are the big places. And usually the toe of her shoe as well are also places that you want to restore that part to. So, and if there was anything else that we wanted to restore it to, that part would be fine. But this is basically how I would go about doing this. Make sense, everyone? Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually get rid of the spill on this. And so this is something that we did last week really quickly, but I want to show you again how to actually do it here as well. The problem is that I have, right now, in order to do this, I've got a smart object here, and I can't paint on that smart object. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make a copy of this entire layer. So the entire layer is selected right now. I'm going to hit Command J. It will make a copy of everything. It's made a copy of the smart object, and it's also made a copy of the mask. I'm going to turn off the eyeball for the virgin that's underneath it. I'm going to get rid of this layer mask. I'm going to pull it down and throw it away. It's gone. And then on the image that's on the top that has the layer mask, I want to be able to then paint on this image to get rid of the spill. To do that, it can't be a smart object. So I'm going to click on, but I've got my virgin down here. That's the reason I went through all of this. This is my virgin that's sitting down on the in the middle here that I'm not going to fuck up. This is the one that I'm going to actually rasterize and then fuck it up. So the top one is now selected. Make sure that the image content is selected, and then up to your layer menu, down to smart objects, down to rasterize, or up to the layer menu, down to rasterize, down to smart object. Either one, they do the exact same thing. And you'll notice now that little square of the smart object part has gone away, and now I can actually paint on this image. So I'm going to grab the B key to get just a regular paintbrush. I'm going to then change the blending mode, the hardness of this brush to 0% hardness. Keep your blending mode at normal right now. I'm actually going to change that from normal down to color, because now when I paint, I don't want this to change the luminosity. I want to keep the brightness range, so the highlights, the shadow, I want to keep all of those. I merely want to change the color of this. So to do that, I've got that part now set right. So my blending mode is color, my opacity is 100%, my flow is 100%. I'm going to go to my tablet now for this kind of work. This is just screaming, cursor, use me. Okay, so we now need to remove the spill. I'm going to start with the boot. I'm down here on the very bottom here. That's where I'm going to actually start to do this with. So what I want to do is I want to paint this green the same color as her boots. Well, to get the color of her boots, with my brushes already selected, I've already set the options for it. If you simply hold down your option key, you will temporarily get a color sampler tool, and you'll see as you click somewhere on the boot, you'll get all these gray color samplers. If you come out and click on the fern, thank you. The ferns that are underneath this, you kind of get a yellowy color. If you click on the green grass, you'll get a green color. The reds that are in the back, it just samples whatever you color, and it just makes the foreground color the sample that you want. So I'm going to click on her shoes to actually get that part, and then simply paint over the green that's on her boot where you see that a spill. Do not start, so here, everybody look at my screen right here. I can attack the spill that's on this back edge one of two ways. I can either start on the boot and then come down and paint on that edge, but if I do that, it will change all of the color of the area that I started on the boot. That color is fine. Don't change shit that doesn't need to be changed. Instead, I'm going to start down on the grass area and come up and just actually get rid of the spill that's on that. I'm also going to get rid of the spill that's on the back edge of her shoe. And then you'll see she's got spill all the way along the side of her boot. She's got it both on the inside and on the outside. That's to be expected. I'm not trying to hide anything. She's got a small amount of spill right in her crotch. You can actually resample the area that's right around her crotch by holding down the option key and clicking again to resample that, and you get rid of the spill color that's in the back. And then if I come up and I look at the gloves, you can see that there's spill on her gloves because they're shiny. So I'm resampling the color up there and painting to get rid of that, and blah, 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 blah. As I get up near her face, her hair specifically, this is now where I want to remove the spill here. To do this, I'm going to again hold down the option key and sample color of her hair. It gives me a little bit of brown. Do not paint on her face with that brown hair color, or you will change her skin color. This is what you'll change it to sort of like this grayed out area here. You do not want to do that. And then I'm simply going to work my way around her hair. Do not paint hair that does not need to have the spill removed. So be very, again, you're always coming from the outside in. And that part's going to continue to work for me. And I'm going to continue to come around. I'm going to resample color as I go along, because you don't want, if you're using just one solid color, it won't work for you, or it'll just look faked for you. So I'm going to continue to work around to get the whole rest of her hair to get rid of that spill. I'm going to resample a darker color down here for the spill that's coming down underneath, closer down here. So in my case right here, if you take a look at my image right here, it may be hard to see on this projector screen, but right in here, it ended up actually painting a color that was way too red for the, it doesn't match the hair color that's around it. You can actually change that by sampling the color that's in the darker area and just paint over the one that you already had. You don't need to undo those things. We are just laying color on top of it. And the minute you pick a new color and lay that on top of it, it replaces the old color. So don't worry about going in and undoing stuff if it's wrong. Simply find a way to actually make it right. There's also color that's out here on the edge that should be this sort of like lighter red. I'm going to sample that color, but this is really fine feathery hair that's actually transitioning into this darker hair color. So what I'm going to do is simply drop the flow of this brush down to around a 5 or 10%. 13 sounds good. And just start to scrub back and forth in here. It builds in that new color slowly. Sometimes it's a mix of colors, and this, if you use a smaller flow or you leave your flow up and use a smaller opacity, you can actually, in effect, mix your colors as you're actually doing this. And this is ultimately how we get rid of the spill and actually also get rid of that edge by choking it. So again, you need to resample a new color. So look at your foreground color. It's probably pretty gray. Go in and find like a redder version of her hair. And then again, like I just said, paint over it. Don't worry about it being the wrong color because the luminosity is still there. You'll notice as we've done all of this, we haven't lost the luminosity. Look what would happen to here. I'm going to actually change this. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to zoom into the shoe again. If I was not using that color blending mode, I'm going to set my blending mode back to normal and watch what happens. So it's now going to be a normal blending mode. Again, I'm going to sample the color of the shoe just by doing this. And then again, working on my pixel layer here. I'm simply going to, oh, actually, let me grab my flow all the way back up again. And then I'm just going to do this. It changes the color, but you lose all the luminosity. You lose the highlights and the shadows and all the detail here. If we're just doing color, then it maintains all the luminosity and you don't end up with this. Does that make sense, everyone? Are there questions about this? All right, I'm going to undo that. All right, we are here. I'm going to try and get through this in 15 minutes. We're going to talk about shadows really quickly here, in part because I'm trying to plant seeds for what's going to happen later. But when we take a look at this image, if you zip all the way back out, to get all the way back out really quickly, just double click on the hand of your tool. So just come out and double click it really fast and it'll pull it back out. This girl is floating in this space. She's not grounded in this composite at all. She's just there, right? And the reason she's just there's a number of reasons that you would maybe not believe this is a composite. When I look at this, I'm not. The girl is far more contrasty than the background is. I mean, there are other issues in this, but the biggest culprit in all of this is that she would be casting some sort of shadows on there, and she's not. So this came up with, because I know I wrote to somebody in their comments about this. Oh. I remember, and I think it was you, Paige. Did you do, when you did your knockouts, you actually built a mask for the background, right? And then had the figure. Yeah. So you'll see what Paige did in just a little bit right here. But if you take a look at an image like this, there's two ways that you could actually go about building this image. So for instance, just look at my screen here really quick. Don't do this. I'm going to make a copy of my background. I'm going to drag the background up now above my figure, so the background is on top of my figure right now. I'm going to turn off the layer mask that's underneath it. If you take a look now, again, both of them will be showing. I can load my layer mask right here, and then I'm going to add it as a layer mask for my background, but I'm going to invert this. And you end up with the same thing. So basically what I've got is, I've got a background now that's on top of her, but it's masked out so that I don't see the background where the girl is, and she's actually coming through that. Does that make sense what's going on here? The problem we get into this, though, is where we're going right now, is shadows. And the way shadows work is that they are always underneath your figure on top of your background. So in this world right now, because my background is on top of my figure, I would have to put shadows on top of this. So I would add a new layer up on here at the very top. This would be shadows. And I would build them, but then I have to mask them so that they do not go on top of the figure. It is a huge pain in the ass. Instead, if I don't have that layer up there like that, if I go back to the way we normally have this, I'm going to drag my shadows right underneath my figure. And now if I build a shadow, I'm just going to do a really big black streak on this so you can sort of see what's happening here. Yeah, get my colors like that. Now if I do a shadow like this, you can see the shadow will always be on the background but never on the girl because she is in the layer stack. The shadow is beneath the girl, so there's no way it can be on top. But the shadows are also on top of my background, so they're exactly where they want to be. Did that make sense, everybody, what I just went through? All right, so shadows. I am going to delete this group of shadows that I just did and add a new one, and I need everybody to do this with me. So what I want you to do is, if you've saved your new version or a version copy of this, go ahead and click on that, and we're simply going to add a new layer on top of it so that it falls underneath the figure but on top of your background. Double click on it, and we're going to call it shadows, and say okay to that. And so there are people who are illustrators who are really good at building shadows. I'm not one of them, and I'll show you this is where the problem ends up being. I'm going to hit the brush again to get the B key. You want to make sure that you have a completely soft brush, normal blending mode, 100% opacity, 100% flow. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, and then I'm going to zoom in to her shoes just a little bit, and I'm just going to do a small paint job that goes right underneath her shoes, and I'm going to do one that goes underneath her other shoe over there. And you can see that some of this begins to kind of work. One of the problems that I have with it is that when I did that whole painting thing, take a look at mine right now. I've got a shadow that's going behind her shoe. This shadow that's right back here on the ground, there's nothing to explain that. This shoe, the bottom of the shoe, underneath the shoe is casting a shadow on the rock and on the moss. That makes sense. But this thing that's up on the top, that doesn't make any sense at all. That shouldn't be there. So I'm going to get rid of this. To get rid of it, you need to set a key for me. So the first thing I'm going to ask you is hit E, the E key by itself. It gives you the eraser tool. You can remember that, E eraser. In the eraser tool, what you want to do on here is you want to, up at the very top, again, your options will change. You want to set it so that it is a brush. You want to click on your drop-down menu to make sure it is a completely soft brush. You want to leave the opacity at 100% and the flow down to 6%. And the reason I have such a low flow on this is that I want to really control where my eraser happens. I don't want to just touch something and have it disappear. I want to slowly get rid of it the same way an eraser, a real eraser would to remove a pencil mark. And now I'm going to, still working on my shadows layer, I can come up and I can start scrubbing on the area that was that background to get rid of that shadow. And so this is now my new shadow that's actually happening on this. But I've got a series of problems with this. One is that it's really dark underneath there, underneath her shoes, so that's not really that believable for me. I've also got a little bit here on the front that I want to get rid of. So you could start to drop your opacity on this a little bit more to sort of like let stuff through. You can start to play all of those games, and it begins to help here a little bit, but unless you're really gifted at doing these hand-painted things, whatever, you're only going to get frustrated with this. So I'm going to show you the way that I build simple shadows. In a couple of weeks, we're going to get into complex shadows and compound shadows. That's ahead of where we're going right now. But this will get you by in 90% of what you're doing in your composites. So this one matters. And shadows, I'm telling you right now, this is the hardest thing there is to do in compositing, in my opinion, is to get the shadows right. So I'm going to start new all over again. So I'm going to throw away that shadows layer. I'm going to just start brand new by creating a new blank layer, double clicking on it and going shadows. Then we're going to do gradients to build these shadows. And so we haven't talked about gradients a lot, so I want to talk about that part really quickly. Double click on the hand really fast so that you can just see what's going on here. I'm going to turn off the eyeball for my figure because I just want to show you the difference in different kinds of gradients, what we can actually have. If you hit the G key, it will give you the gradient tool. If you can't remember that part, it's really pretty much right in the middle of your tool palette. It looks like a gradient, a small square. If you've got, there's other tools that are underneath this. If you click on the lower flyout, you can get the paint bucket tool, in which case your thing will look like a paint bucket. I don't want to use that. I want to do the gradient tool, so I'm going to go back to the gradient tool. Again, as soon as you do that, you should actually pay attention to your options palette up at the very top. You can see at the very top I've actually got the word gradient, but I've also got a drop-down menu here. If you click on that drop-down menu, it's a preview of the gradients that you're using. You'll get this drop-down menu. You should have a series of folders that are underneath this that are pre-made gradients for you. If you open up the basics one, you have 3 that are standard at the very top. If you hover over them, you should get a readout at a certain point of what they really are. The first one, if I actually hold this down, It's tricky. There we go. We get the readout. It's foreground to background. And because my foreground is black and my background is white, it's giving me a black to white one. The next one over, if you click again on the thumbnail, the next one over, and then hover over it just a little bit, it is foreground to transparent. That's what we're going to use for all of our shadow work. And then finally, the last one that's over is by default, or at least it always has been, it's just a black to white. It doesn't have anything to do with foreground and background. But you want to select the one in the middle. It's going to be foreground to transparent. And again, because foreground color is black, that's what we want. If your foreground color, if you do a drop-down menu to get rid of that, hit the X key to make your foreground color white. Then you'll notice that, again, the drop-down here menu gives you white to transparent. Again, I'm going to close that up, hit the X key. I want black, so I want this to be black to transparent. And then you have types of gradient. There's 5 of them that run across the top, and this is why I turned off the eyeball. We've got our shadow layers that's actually active and the eyeball's on. If we then grab the gradient tool, I'm just going to hover right in the middle of my screen. I'm going to click on the left-hand side and drag across. Have you guys seen the new gradient tool? This is the new gradient tool here. So this is now with the latest version of Photoshop. This lets you really fine-tune your gradients in terms of how they actually work. If you turn off everybody else, so I'm going to turn off my background as well, just so that you can sort of see what's happening. So I'm going from foreground to background. I'm going to actually hit Command Z to undo that. I want you to see what these gradients really look like, the differences. So go back to the type of gradient, whether we're going from foreground to transparent or foreground to background, pick the foreground to background version of this. And then again, come back over to your image and simply click on the left-hand side, drag all the way to the right-hand side, and you'll actually see you've got a linear gradient that goes from black to white, simply washes across your screen. Command Z to undo that. Go to your next. So now I'm looking at the little icons that sit at the top, not the preview where you pick foreground to background, but the little icons that are next to it. By default, the first one, the gradient, the linear gradient, is the one we just did. I want you to select the next little icon. It looks like a square. It looks like a circle with vignetted edges coming in. This is actually a circular gradient. So now if you click in the middle of your image and drag out, you'll see that it goes from foreground to background. Again, foreground color is black to background is white. So it gives you, this is a circular gradient. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. The next one that's actually over, again, start in the middle and drag out. So this one is supposed to look like the inside of a cone. So if you imagine having a cone hover over the top of you and you're looking up to where it all converges to a vanishing point at the very pinnacle of the cone, whatever, that's supposed to be the illusion that you get with this. Command Z to undo that. To go to the next one over. The next one is a reflected gradient. If you start still in the middle of your image, but sort of towards the top part of your image and click and drag down, well, actually I take it back, Command Z to undo that. Start right in the middle, click and drag down. You get what they call a reflected gradient. And what that means is that you're starting with black, your foreground color in the middle, and it actually transitions to white, but it does it on both the upper end and the lower end. So one is supposed to be a reflection of the other. That's why they call this a reflected gradient. This actually works out for us when we're trying to introduce depth of field in smart filter masks that blur your image. So Command Z to undo that. And then finally the last one is sort of the inverse of the cone one. Again, select it and drag out of the very middle. This is actually supposed to then either look like you're still inside that building looking up, or that you're actually on the outside of the building now, outside of the cone looking straight down on top of it. I think the cone ones are a little bit on the weak side. I don't really know anybody who uses them a lot, but I guess if it's something you needed, you would want to have it. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And the final one I'm going to go back to is the way I want you to select yours is click on the options. So the one that's the sort of the gradient previews, pick the one in the middle that is going to be foreground to transparent, and then you also want to click on the radial gradient, the second of the little icons from the left, because we are going to make circles. That's where we're going to be working on this. I'm going to turn on my very top layer that is the figure. I'm going to select my shadows layer, the one that I had already made, that is on top of my background but underneath the girl. And then I'm going to zoom in here to her foot. Now watch my screen. I'm going to show you how I do this. It's the same process over and over and over and over and over again. Click on an area that's near where you're working, drag out. This will give you a circular gradient that looks like this. Hit Command T, which will allow you to transform this. You gotta be kidding me. Welcome to the new gradient tool that doesn't let you do the shit that I've been doing for years. Okay, we're not going to do simple shadows today until I can figure that part out. Okay, choking and spreading, we're good on that part, right? You can close this image up. You do not need to save it. And now would be a great time for a break. So let's call this 225. Let's do a hard 10. Be back at 235.